Good evening. Welcome back to this series of lectures on the psychology of religion. After our 1 week break, I hope not too many of you turned up at the same time last week for this lecture. I nearly did myself, I confess. To jog your memories, last time we discussed what I called cognitive theories of religion as contrasted to functionalist ones. Cognitive theories are those that have something to do with how the mind processes information. The two dominant ideas had to do with our ability to make causal inferences and our tendency to anthropomorphize things. And towards the end of the previous lecture, I also introduced you to Freud's and Jung's cognitive architectures, or what they supposed the mind was like. Tonight, we will pick up where we left off to consider functionalist theories of religion. Functionalist views refer to some role that religion plays, or some benefit it confers, or some need it fulfills in the life of the individual or society. Having introduced Taylor's and Fraser's theories as cognitive theories last time, I should also add that they can be interpreted in functionalist terms as well. The curiosity that Taylor attributes to human beings can be seen as a need to explain natural phenomena. Similarly, Fraser clearly begins with basic human needs that lead to the need to control the natural environment so that these basic requirements can be met. But let's spend a bit more time on the functionalism in Jung and Freud. For Jung, religion comes from a psychic drive towards discovering the self. Jung argues that human beings have a fundamental need to discover ourself, which involves balancing and integrating the various aspects of our psyche. The conscious and unconscious, the anima and animus, the persona and shadow, the ego and the self archetypes. Now, recall that the self archetype is empirically indistinguishable from the God archetype. They produce the same images, which we, with the help of our psychoanalyst, have to interpret. So Jung's theory of religion is not just that there exists a God archetype in our psyches, but that we are driven to seek it as part of the process of seeking our true selves. One way of thinking about this is to compare Jung to Fraser and to Taylor, and to see that his theory is closer to Taylor's than to Fraser's. Recall that Fraser believed religion to be an attempt to understand and control the external world, whereas Taylor believed religion to be, at least at the beginning, an attempt to understand something about ourselves, and specifically about psychological phenomena like dreams. Jung's view takes this Taylorian starting point to its extreme. He thinks that religious beliefs and myths of all kinds are essentially attempts at self-understanding, means by which our conscious minds try to connect with the unconscious. But he also rejects Taylor's conclusion, shared with Fraser, that religious ideas are attempts to explain things. Rather, Jung takes them to be attempts to reconcile otherwise conflicting elements within ourselves with the ultimate end of psychological health. Furthermore, there is a sense in which Jung's theory is more cognitive than Taylor's and Fraser's, and perhaps even Freud's. Taylor and Fraser both posit certain innate tendencies, and as we have just seen, also needs, but they do not believe that religious ideas themselves to be innate. They come about by inference. In contrast, for Jung, religious ideas themselves are innate, generated by the archetype forms that are a part of our collective unconscious. The drive towards self-understanding is a fundamental and active force in Jung's theory, but it is a force to uncover something already inside of us. My own response and evaluation of Jung's theory is that it raises more questions than it answers, which is not always a problem for a theory, as long as it also provides some way to investigate these further questions being thrown up. In this particular case, the two obvious questions that arise are, first, why we have these archetypes in the first place, and second, why the self and God archetypes are formally distinct but empirically identical. The hypothesis that we have innate ideas is not itself puzzling. There are good evolutionary reasons for the heritability of certain cognitive predispositions. But archetypes are not any old innate ideas, but ones that enable the conscious to connect with the unconscious to the end of self-understanding and self-actualization. For such things to evolve, we, and Jung, must assume that self-understanding and self-actualization are evolutionarily advantageous. But as far as I know, he never quite argues for this assumption. The premise that the self and God archetypes are empirically identical is simply puzzling. I would try to summarize why Jung thinks this and what evidence he brings to bear on the hypothesis. But the more I read Jung, the less confident I am that I understand him. So I'm going to disappoint you on this front. I simply don't really know what the argument is. There doesn't seem to be one, though I'm sure defenders of Jung would be happy to disagree with me. On then to Freud, whose ideas are also mad, but I think in a more tractable sort of way. Recall that for Freud, the unconscious contains things that are repressed, things that are prone to percolate back up into the unconscious, into the conscious as neuroses. For our purposes, there are three kinds of things that have been repressed: edible desires, a desire for security, and a primordial patricide. And now Freud tells a story. Once upon a time, long, long ago in our evolutionary past, a band of brothers grew jealous of their father and of his possession of their mother. They had what Freud famously called edible desires towards their mother, and therefore jealousy against their father, so much so that it translated into murderous intent and indeed patricide itself. The brothers ganged up against the father and killed him. But upon killing their father, they realized that they have lost an important source of security and strength. Furthermore, despite their jealousy, they did also genuinely love their father, and so they felt real guilt for their crime. These, the edible desires for the mother, the traumatic and guilt-laden memories of patricide, the desire for security that it left, all required repression. Too awful were they to behold in the consciousness. But as repressed things are prone to do, they re-emerged, transformed into neurotic beliefs and behaviors such as these. Funerary rites were invented to cope with the contradictory feelings towards the father's corpse. On one hand, it is the body of a beloved. On the other, it is a reminder of sin. And so it is disposed of, but with care. Incest taboos were enacted and enforced. The desire that led to the crime was strongly discouraged by sanction and punishment. And the father, the figure of strength and security, was replaced by an immortal father in heaven, the sky god found across many cultures. These repressed feelings and memories we have all inherited. And so the neuroses perpetually percolate generation after generation. Nobody really takes this theory seriously anymore. But the book in which it is articulated, Totem and Taboo, is still well worth reading because the argument is laid out with commendable clarity. Indeed, its clarity is what makes its flaws so visible. In terms of evidence, Freud's theory is like Jung's, sorely lacking. but does actually draw on scholarship, then recent, some of which still holds up. The idea of the band of brothers is a sort of creative extrapolation of an idea of Darwin's, but is almost certainly a misreading of Darwin taken out of context. Darwin did think, based on observations of primates and other animals, that our human ancestors lived in small groups, essentially harems, where there was a dominant male who had exclusive sexual access to the females. This dominant male would then eventually be displaced by mortal combat by one of his sons, and so the cycle proceeds. This happens to be true, more or less, of lions. Whether or not it is true of any early hominids, it is not clear now. It is not difficult to see how Freud took this idea and turned it to his own purposes. His other source is the work in vogue in the early 20th century on totemism in Australia and North America. Freud, of course, was not alone in his interest with this work. Almost all theorists of religion at the time were as well. And as we shall see, this is certainly true of Durkheim. Totem and Taboo is not Freud's only book on religion. He seems to have been obsessed by the subject. His very first book is brief and its thesis simple. He identifies ritual behavior as a sort of obsessive-compulsive disorder. That's basically the summary of that book. His book, After Totem, is arguably his most famous, in which he comes closest to Marx. In The Future of an Illusion, religion is wish fulfillment, an illusion that protects us against the awful truths of life, in particular, that life eventually comes to an end. Civilization and its discontents adds an experiential dimension to the theory articulated in Future, but not really in a way that James, Otto, and Eliade would approve. There is, Freud says, a feeling of wholeness, limitlessness, and eternality that human beings seek and sometimes even manage to obtain. And this too is a building block of religion. Finally, Moses and Monotheism was Freud's very last book, published the same year that he died, and it is quite mad. I'm not sure I understand it despite several rereadings. What he does in this book is he reconstructs the Moses story from the Bible and draws all kinds of psychological and historical conclusions from his retelling. There is a lot in the book that was already argued for in Totem and Taboo, but less clearly in this latter contribution. He also adds here the idea that the intellectual rigors of monotheism eventually made the Jews clever and more able to think abstractly, which is a condition for scientific theorizing. So in a funny kind of way, Freud, that great enemy of religion, self-proclaimed, credits science to religion, at least among the Jews. Having mentioned wish fulfillment in Freud's Future of an Illusion, it seems fitting to briefly now discuss Ludwig Feuerbach, who got there first nearly a century earlier. Feuerbach was a philosopher and a theologian of sorts, initially heavily influenced by Hegel, whom he ended up repudiating. I happen to find Hegel also mostly impenetrable, though not quite as impenetrable as Jung. And true to form, Feuerbach's early work on religion is not easy to understand. The basic idea, though, is that Christianity, and he thinks religion more generally, is the product of our love of ourselves, projected beyond ourselves or alienated from ourselves, as he would say. That is, the best features of humanity were combined and reified to become God. Though why Feuerbach thinks we do this is not always clear. One view is that he thought that human beings suffered from something like chronic low self-esteem. So the best of us had to be protected from us and so we project it away to heaven, where it can remain unsullied by human foibles. Religion is, in this sense, idealization. Another related view is that the idealization and projection of humanity, that is, humanity's divinization or apotheosis, is an act of wish fulfillment itself. We wish human beings were just the best parts of us and none of the nasty bits. But seeing that that's not true, we want desperately to believe that there is something else that is just the best part of us and without all the nasty bits. And so we create God in our idealized image. You can see something of Freud here with Freud's idea of creating God to be a bit like the Father, but without mortal limitations. The older Feuerbach, writing in the mid-1800s, is somewhat clearer, perhaps for having abandoned his old master, Hegel. The element of projection remains in the older Feuerbach, but it is now clear that religion comes from humanity's realization that we are utterly dependent on so much around us, and we desire to be freed from this dependence. This idea is in early theories too, of course, which we have already seen. But they, Lucretius and Hume especially, focused on fear as the emotional response to our dependency on nature. Without denying that fear is the most obvious and widespread emotional reaction, Feuerbach argues that the realization of our dependency also generates other, even positive feelings, like gratitude and love. After all, the same natural conditions, thunderstorms, say, can and have and do inspire fear in people as well as awe and admiration. In any case, we want to be free from our dependency, says Feuerbach, and so we turn to nature with a capital N. And we turn nature with a capital N into a power that can free us from our dependency and finitude, and especially our mortality. The Freud of the future of an illusion is clearly indebted to Feuerbach here. And really, the idea of religion as wish fulfillment is more appropriately credited to him than to Freud. Death has been mentioned a few times already, but in and amongst a litany of other concerns. Towards the middle and second half of the 20th century, however, in part thanks to Feuerbach and Freud, it begins to take center stage in theories of religion. Hints of this shift can be seen a little earlier, though, especially in the work of Bronisław Malinowski, a generation after Freud, but whose working life overlapped significantly with his. Now, Malinowski is particularly important to our story from a methodological perspective and not just a substantive theoretical one. Most of the people we have covered so far relied on what we might call secondary data, observations made by other people and published in books and papers. And typically these observations are not made by scientists, but by merchants and travelers and missionaries. Those who did collect their own data, like Jung and Freud, collected very limited amounts in their clinical practice. You might recall that I called them erudite clinicians. They read about totemism, but never spoke to anyone who practiced it, really. Malinowski's career began in this way as well. He wrote about Australian Aboriginal culture based on other people's observations, but he found this deeply dissatisfying. And so he went to live in and around Papua New Guinea and Melanesia for several years. Furthermore, he lived amongst the people he was studying, though still did rely heavily on informants, not all of whom were honest to him or forthright. In any case, Malinowski continued to be a great proponent of ethnography and a great critic of those who relied solely on second-hand observations. In fact, he reserved some of his strongest criticisms to ethnographers and anthropologists who, like him, went out into the field, but instead of living with and amongst the people they were studying, decided to stay in cushy hotels in town instead, just asking people in town what those people in villages were like. He really didn't like that. From Malinowski's perspective, it was only by direct and close observation that hypotheses could be tested. Malinowski insisted that anthropology was to be a science in this way, which is to say, empirically. All the same, his radical methodological views did not entail a jettisoning of all the ideas that came before, especially those found in Taylor and Fraser, his direct predecessors. Indeed, just as reading Taylor inspired Fraser, so reading Fraser inspired Malinowski, even though the two were quite methodologically at odds. Malinowski's theory of religion ends up being a version of Taylor's animism, however, but with a functionalist, almost Humean, and perhaps morbid twist. It is Taylor once more with feeling, if you like. For Taylor, religion begins as a doctrine of souls, which in turn arose as an explanation for various phenomena like dreaming and the difference between life, death, and sleep. Malinowski similarly thought that religion began as the doctrine of souls, but in his case, the doctrine arose to quell the fear of death. We can see in this passage here, Malinowski's genius for criticizing his forebears, Taylor in this case, while appropriating their ideas. He readily acknowledges what Taylor says about dreams, but makes it just a part of his theory whose focus is altogether different. As evidence for the primacy of the fear of death, Malinowski cites his and others' observations of the human obsession with and ambivalence towards death. I have already mentioned when discussing Freud, this ambivalence felt over corpses. They are on one hand reminders of our mortality, and on the other reminders of people we love, and so we want to get rid of them and also preserve them all at the same time. This conflict leads us to design and perform elaborate funerary rites as costly and effortful means to disposing corpses. Malinowski also observes that the people he studied take an attitude towards death not at all unlike his own and those of his countrymen, despite their other differences, and in particular, their closeness to death, both human and animal. Despite their familiarity with death, they too are afraid of it, no less so than Westerners are with our farmers and butchers and medical professionals and hospices. We are often removed from death, having successfully privatized and sanitized it. A lot of people I talk to today still believe that we might be more afraid of death now than people who live in cultures who are more familiar with death, for whom death is a more salient part of everyday life. And having run studies of my own on this subject, I can quite confidently say that that is not true, that a cultural familiarity with death, it does not predict a lower fear of death than in places like ours, like in this country, where death is more privatized and sanitized. And Malinowski was making precisely this point. Furthermore, on death, unlike the other vicissitudes of life, no amount of technology, whether modern or primitive, whether scientific or magical, has yet been able to solve this most common and most universal of problems, and not for lack of trying. Death is a universal problem, and so the fear of death too is plausibly psychologically universal, also Malinowski argues. This dual universality is what makes it attractive to Malinowski and others as a fundamental need for religion to fill. And so a few decades after Malinowski, the psychoanalytic cultural theorist Ernest Becker takes this focus on death further still. For Becker, our awareness and fear of our mortality is not just a major factor in the origins of religion, but in the origins of all human endeavors and achievements. The fear of death, says Becker, is so crippling and paralyzing that we bring every resource we have to keep it at bay, whether by repression in quasi-Freudian mode, or by distraction, or by self-persuasion that we will live on, after all, in what we make, in our legacies, whatever they may look like. And so it happens that works of art and architecture, systems of philosophy and theology, families and tribes and nation states are all immortality projects, attempts to live on in something larger and more longevous than ourselves. Religion, and organized religion in particular, is a staggeringly powerful vehicle to carry away our death anxiety. Not only do many religions promise literal immortality, they also provide many opportunities for symbolic immortality as well. Religion inspires the aforementioned art and architecture that are also examples of symbolic immortality projects. The patrons of such longevous objects are remembered long after they are dead. We see this even in our humble parish churches, with names on plaques permanently affixed to all manner of objects, from candlesticks to pews, removable only by faculty. Religious communities also function like families and nation states in terms of their longevity, well beyond the lives of any individual people. This is especially true if the communities themselves keep the memories of the dead alive, such as in our prayers. But as Becker warns here, most immortality projects are ultimately ineffective. They are either fragile or lead towards various evils. In our zeal to live forever through our national identities, for example, we seek to overpower other nations to reassure ourselves that we are in the best group, the best nation, the best religion, the only true religion. To maintain our trust in the promises of the gods, we attempt to silence other gods. Becker does propose an ideal type of religion for the purposes of quelling our death anxiety, which he catches glimpses of in the theologies of Søren Kierkegaard and Paul Tillich, but which can also be seen in other religious traditions that emphasize an utterly transcendent God who needs nothing from creatures, but raises us beyond our petty concerns. Becker's 1974, The Denial of Death, is a work of genius, even if one thinks, as one is likely to, that his thesis is much too audacious. Besides David Hume's Natural History of Religion, I commend this to you for further reading after this series of lectures. This might surprise you somewhat, as the idea that religion arises from the fear of death seems completely obvious to most people today. I took a poll, I did a little survey of a few hundred people while I was doing my doctorate about 10 years ago, asking people what they thought the source of religion was psychologically. And by far, the most common response was people thought that religion came from a fear of death. And many of you may also have heard of this idea, certainly before today. But as I tried to say, or I tried to hint a little earlier, this idea really wasn't very prominent, certainly before Freud, almost certainly before Malinowski even. And it was people like Malinowski and Becker quite recently who put it on the map, put this idea on the map. Now, as we have been reading them, Jung, Freud, Feuerbach, Malinowski, Becker are all individualist theorists, focused on the roles that religion plays in the lives of individuals. In many cases, their thought also contains a social component, but it is my contention that this is not the main part. And so we end this lecture with 1.5 social functionalist theories of religion. The first is Emile Durkheim's, whose method has already been remarked upon. Rather than collecting data from many, many diverse cultures, he closely studies a single phenomenon, which he argues is the most basic and primitive of religions, totemism, which we have seen already. And totemism, especially as practiced by Australian Aboriginals. This is the only thing he shares in common with Freud, despite the fact that they were writing around the same time. We know that Freud did read Durkheim, though I'm not sure of the other way around. I could find no evidence that Durkheim had ever read Freud. In any case, you may recall that Durkheim's definition of religion stands out as being very much not about gods. The word gods does not appear in his definition, and nothing like it does. And this definitional point leads Durkheim to reject theories that revolve around gods, like Taylor's and Fraser's. And also, it leads him to examine phenomena that are religious without foregrounding gods or other spiritual beings. Totemism thus presents fertile ground for Durkheim's theorizing. Totemism isn't about gods, or at least not fundamentally or primarily about gods. Totems, as you may know, usually represent animals, but Durkheim argues they aren't really about the animals either, but rather about impersonal totemic forces, or the totemic principle, as he calls it. He finds this idea of a totemic force, and if you're thinking of Star Wars, you would not be entirely mistaken. He finds this idea of a force also in other cultures, including Polynesian and American ones. I can add to the Wakan of North America and Mana of Polynesia and Melanesia, the Chi from East Asian cultures, perhaps now more familiar to Western audiences through martial arts films. These are all, for Durkheim, examples of a non-personal or an impersonal supernatural force, which he calls the totemic principle. Gods are, according to Durkheim, later reifications and personifications of what begins as an impersonal force. Souls and other spiritual beings are also transmutations of this totemic principle. And the totem represents these personified forces via animals, but this, and this is Durkheim's critical move, but the totem also represents the clan itself in exactly the same way that a flag might, which accounts for why it is often considered disloyal, if not simply treasonous, to desecrate a flag. But if the totem represents both the clan and the god, surely, Durkheim says, this is because the clan and the god are in fact one and the same. Gods, reifications and personifications of the totemic principle are also reifications and personifications of clans. The force of Durkheim's rhetoric is not unpersuasive, but the argument is formally invalid, and quite transparently so. It is obvious that one sign can represent two totally independent things. Even words can function in this way. Consider the sign that comprises the Latin letters B, A, and T. Even if we just limit our analysis to the English language, this sign refers to both a flying mammal and a piece of sports equipment, and no one would suggest that they are identical things. But never mind. If we accept Durkheim's conclusion, despite the dubious logic, then to praise the gods is to praise the clan, which is to show loyalty. Now, a similar thing can be said about the relationship between the clan and the soul. To say that the soul is the totemic principle personified and located inside the individual is by the same logic to say that the clan is also located in the individual. And to say that the soul survives death of the individual is therefore a way of saying that the clan does so as well. This latter claim is an inversion of Becker's argument, which we have seen earlier. For Becker, the longevity of the culture provides symbolic immortality to the individual, which is what is primary. For Durkheim, the belief in individual personal immortality is really a means for expressing the greatness of the society, which is what matters to Durkheim. So far, we have not heard how this divinization of the clan happens, but Durkheim does have an answer. The argument basically takes the form of, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it is a duck. He points out that societies, like gods, are authorities on whom we depend. They keep us in check, making demands on our behavior, and we need them for our survival and thriving. And indeed, they cannot perform either job without our faith in them. Societies, like gods, only work if we have faith in them. If nobody believed in God, God would be an ineffective moral policing device after all. And even in modern societies, perhaps more so now than before, societies run in faith. Faith in markets, faith in the government, faith in fiat currency. On this analogy between gods and societies, Durkheim builds his psychological theory that in the minds of believers, societies are divinized. And finally, perhaps the most famous line about religion of all, Marx's religion is the opium of the people. There is not really a theory of religion here, but I always feel obliged to cover Marx. Roughly speaking, Marx agreed with the younger Feuerbach. God is humanity's alienation from the best of itself. But for Marx, the true source of this alienation is a yet deeper alienation. And there is nothing deeper to Marx than economics. It is the alienation of labor from the worker who is compelled in a capitalist economy to surrender her labor, her act of self-expression to the owners of the means of production in exchange for mere wages. That is the meaning of the opening sentence here. And having expressed economic distress in religious terms, we find religion as a balm, but it is a dangerous balm, distracting us from the sources of our real problems. And so religion also becomes complicit in the evils of capitalism. And before there was capitalism, likewise, religion was complicit in the evils of feudalism, and so on and so forth. The reason I don't really think this is much of a theory is that Marx never really explains why economic oppression manifests itself in a religious sigh. His argumentative strategy is to draw analogies between Feuerbach's theory of religion as alienation and his own theory of economic alienation, and connects the two causally. This is not unlike Durkheim's strategy to causally connect gods and societies, but to be a little harsh, these seem to be examples of what Fraser would call imitative magic. Here are two things, economic alienation and religious alienation, that look a bit like each other, so they must be the same thing. in summary, we have covered functionalism of two broad kinds: psychological and social. Under the psychological, we saw a variety of needs and desires at the individual level. And under the social, we covered roles religion might serve at the societal level. These lists are not exhaustive, however, especially on the psychological side. Religion has been hypothesized to fulfill even more needs than these, some of which we will mention in our next lecture, which brings us up to our own time from the 1990s onwards. And if I may, a brief autobiographical note: when I was first starting my own doctoral research, I thought I would be working on these psychological functionalist theories on religion. So I made a list of potential motivations toward religious belief, thinking that I would run experiments on all of them. And I started the list with the fear of death, and there were 4 or 5 other things, other objects on the list. And 10 years later, I've only really just about gone past the first item on the list, which goes to show how slowly science can move sometimes. Thank you. Grand. And now we have some time for questions, if we have any. And again, the protocol is to either type your questions into the comments box, or if you like, unmute yourself and just, ask out loud. We do have one question in the comment box. Michael Truman asks, how does the idea that religion is a response to death fit in with religions that don't have a belief in individual survival after death, Sikhism, the nirvana of Buddhism, and so forth? So this is a very good question. There are 3 ways to respond to the question, the latter 2 of which are related to one another. So the first thing to say is we've heard something like it already in the first lecture when we discussed how definitions of religion that involve gods deal with counterexamples like Theravada Buddhism, which does not involve gods, formally speaking. And it's to point out that the vast majority of people who subscribe to these religious teachings somehow or other still believe in an afterlife, even though it formally contradicts the teachings of their religion. So I grew up in Malaysia, and I grew up in a sort of nominally, if you like, Buddhist country. And it's Mahayana Buddhism, so the views of the afterlife are kind of, all over the place anyway. But if you talk to Buddhists back home, they do 2 things at the same time. One is they go to temple, or I should say we at the time go to temple and offer offerings in order to shore up karma, so that we will obtain nirvana. But then, of course, either obtain nirvana or more likely, really, obtain a pleasant reincarnated life, right? So what that implies is that we believed that when we die, we will either turn up again in another mortal life, or we would be in nirvana. However, several times a year, we will also set up altars to offer offerings to our ancestors, right? Okay, so these 2 practices are formally contradictory, right? If we believe that people either became some other organism after they died, or that they've achieved nirvana, then there is no point offering sacrifices to our ancestors, who are presumably in some kind of afterlife realm and need our sacrifices to enjoy life or something like that there, right? Literally nobody is bothered by this contradiction, right? We happily just lived with the contradiction like all throughout our lives. And like I have since asked people, wait a second, why do we do these 2 things? And basically people tell you to shut up and go away, and that this is a dumb question, right? The contradiction just doesn't bother people. So that's one response to this question, which is, look, there are these formal teachings of these theologies, and for the most part, they're just disregarded by regular people who somehow or the other still find ways to believe in an afterlife of some kind. Yes, well, kind of. So Michael asked a follow-up question about whether or not it's a bit like the Japanese following both Buddhism and Shinto. Kind of. I mean, in this case, you could say that it's Buddhism on one hand, and then a melange of Taoism and Confucianism on the other. So the ancestor worship comes from the Taoist Confucius side of things, and the going to temple to shore up to improve your karma comes from the Buddhist side of things. So I think that's essentially right. I will say Japanese religion is very difficult to talk about. You know, like I argue with other scholars about this all the time about whether or not the Japanese are religious, and a lot of scholars will tell you that the Japanese are just not religious. And if you take a census poll, you'll see that well over 50% of the population there would just claim to be not religious at all. And in fact, we have this stereotype, don't we, that Japanese religion is Shinto, but only 3% of the Japanese population will check Shinto on a census form. So despite the fact that Shinto really does seem like the national religion of Japan, and it is in some ways, right? The emperor will perform Shinto rituals as part of his duty. Despite that, it's really just 3% of the population who say that they're Shinto. And some of you might know, the Japanese often, you know, will as it were be born a Buddhist, be married a Christian, and be buried a Shinto, which is to say that the different rites of passage are associated with different religious traditions as to the taste of the general population. So I work a lot in Japan, and it's very vexing. It's very confusing if you come from the study of religion from a kind of Western Abrahamic perspective. Okay, so that was just the first response to the sort of you know, how do you deal with the death thing if you're thinking about a religion that doesn't involve an afterlife. The second thing is to say that, of course, in most cases, and it's like, and I'm thinking of Nirvana in particular, there is some kind of afterlife being theorized. It's not a personal afterlife, but it's nevertheless an afterlife. And it's an afterlife that resembles a bit more the sort of symbolic immortality that I talked about earlier, the kind of living on in your group or in your family or in your work, that kind of thing. And of course, that leads me to the third thing, which is that in all these other religious traditions, there is capacity for symbolic immortality. And in a religion in particular, like Buddhism and Sikhism, these are very ancient religions. And so the idea that you can in some way live on in the fact that your religion lives on is much more plausible in those cases than in, say, for new religious movements that, you know, would have come up in like the 70s or 80s or 90s or something like this. So those are the three kind of ways theorists think about the fear of death theories when it comes to religions like these. Either saying that, look, a lot of these people still believe in an afterlife despite their former religious teachings. B, even these religions that don't have a personal afterlife have some kind of afterlife that's less personal. And C, the opportunity for symbolic immortality is still very strong. Are there any other questions? No, great. So the lecture next week will be the longest lecture because I'm going to try to sort of cram in as much as possible of 21st century stuff into one lecture. So in some ways, I could have decided to do 6 lectures just on next week's topic, which is the contemporary stuff. But I thought it was important to give some historic grounding before we get there. And then the 6th and final lecture, will probably be the shortest lecture, and we'll be thinking a little bit about the theological and philosophical implications of these sorts of theories of religion. And you know, like I'm hoping that that's some opportunity for a bit of debate. Thank you very much for coming, and I will see you next week.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.